on? Are we live? Good morning, everybody. I'm Jim Steinberg. I'm the Dean of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. I'm delighted to be here with you. I have the sad privilege of letting you know first thing that unfortunately our friend Jeff Bader cannot be with us this morning. Jeff had some illness in the family at the last moment and had to stay behind. And so I'm going to try to channel Jeff Bader in addition to being the moderator of this panel. I'm also going to try to say a few things that I think Jeff might have said were he here. The title of our panel this morning is Prospects for Shared Leadership. And what that raises in my mind is the two obvious questions, which is shared leadership with whom and shared leadership for what? And those are the issues that I hope we're going to have a chance to explore and then look forward both through the discussion in the panel and with you all to look at some of those issues. From the perspective not only of the United States, obviously, which is heavily represented on this panel, but also from South Korea and looking at some of the other key players in the region. We have a terrific panel with us here this morning. To my immediate left is Rich Falkenrath, who is an adjunct senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and also serves as a principal of the Chertoff Group. But from my perspective, even more important, he's a senior associate at our Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism Studies at Syracuse University. Some of you know that Rich has had a very distinguished career in public service. He was the Deputy Commissioner for the New York Police Department for Counterterrorism. He'd been a senior fellow at Brookings, and he had several senior positions in the Bush administration from 2001 to 2004, an incredibly important time for American foreign policy and strategy. To his left, Jonathan Pollack, who's a senior research fellow at the John Thornton Center at Brookings, one of my former homes. He had been a professor of Asian and Pacific Studies at the Naval War College, and also, probably not known to many of you, he used to be my boss at RAND. I was at RAND
long ago,
1989 to 1993, and Jonathan was the head of the behavioral science department. Whatever it was called then, but I worked for him. And so it's great that we've been able to stay close and colleagues for such a long time. And at the far left, Dr. Choi Kang, who's a professor and Director General of American Studies at Korea's National Diplomatic Academy. He's been a South Korean delegate for the four-party talks. He's had advisory posts for a number of key South Korean institutions, including the National Assembly, the Ministry of National Defense, and the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Trade for South Korea, and is a distinguished graduate of a PhD from Ohio State. So I'm going to actually just say a word or two to begin the panel, because I would have called on Jeff first to try to help frame the issue, and then I'll turn to my colleagues. In his State of the Union speech this year, President Obama revived a term that predated to a previous administration that I'd served in which he described the United States as an indispensable nation. And in trying to think about what that means, and particularly in the context of the issue we're talking about here, I think it's useful to think about the formula that Secretary Clinton has used when talking about U.S. engagement in Asia-Pacific and more broadly as part of U.S. national strategy. She regularly says that the challenges of our time are such that no country acting on its own can solve them by themselves, but that none of the major problems can be solved without the engagement of the United States. And I think that's a perspective which really is very relevant to today's topic, because what it implies from the perspective of the Obama administration, and I want to make clear that I'm here speaking in my private capacity and not in any sense for the Obama administration, is that there is a critical commitment to leadership on the part of the United States in the Asia-Pacific, as is elsewhere, but a recognition that this is not something that the United States can or should want to attempt to do unilaterally, that there is a critical need for partnerships in dealing with the full range of challenges on the security, economic, and political front, and that, from my perspective, both as a former participant in the administration and now as an outside observer, that the strategy has tried to keep in mind both of those dimensions, which is to say a critical commitment to sustained leadership by the United States and engagement, but a recognition that the United States needs a full range of partners. And that strategy, which has been outlined by Secretary Clinton and others, is sort of has three dimensions to it. that it begins with a commitment to sustaining the traditional partnerships and alliances that the United States has had in the Asia-Pacific. Even though they've gone through a process of transformation with the end of the Cold War, they still remain at the core of the nature of the U.S. engagement in the region, particularly with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, but also some of our other traditional allies, including Thailand and the Philippines. That the second level is to expand that circle of engagement to include some of the new and emerging powers, which obviously includes China, but India as well, and Indonesia, Vietnam, and others, as part of a broader diversification of relationships in the region. And that the third component is multilateral engagement through the multilateral institutions, both on the political front and on the economic front. And so the decision by the United States to join and become active in the EAS, the decision to revitalize U.S. economic engagement in the region, both through APEC and through the energizing of the TPP process, are all examples of complementing these traditional alliances and relationships with the new emerging powers to include the multilateral institutions. And I think that this is a strategy that applies, again, across all dimensions of the nature of U.S. interests in the region. And so there is a clear commitment, I think, on the part of the United States to take this perspective of leadership by partnership and to try to apply this as a kind of a deep approach to the region, whether it's on issues of security or trade or climate or energy and the like. And I think we can discuss how that plays out in different contexts. But it's also important, having now articulated for you, my perspective of how the administration might think about the question of prospects for shared leadership, to look then, first of all, how broadly is this shared in the United States? And we're fortunate in having Dr. Falkenrath here, who's had some experience with previous administrations, and how much is this a Obama commitment as opposed to a broader U.S. strategy? And then to look also at the question of how this is seen from the perspective of our partners and how they see the prospects for shared leadership and how they interpret U.S. strategy. So in the spirit of this panel, we're going to have about 5 to 7 minutes from each of the panelists. We'll have a little discussion among ourselves and then look forward to your thoughts, comments, and questions as well. So let me turn to Dr. Falkenrath first.
Thanks very much, Jim. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially with Jim, who's been a friend for a long time, someone I admire tremendously. There's a couple of things I want to focus on. The first is we're now entering the season. It's always about a 6-month season. It comes every 4 years, where we speculate about what happens in some key foreign policy issue depending on the outcome of the presidential election. And so we're just now beginning that because it looks like we know who the two candidates are going to be. And I wanted to give you some sense of how that will go. Clearly, if President Obama wins the re-election, you can expect substantial continuity. But if Mitt Romney were to win it, you'd have change. And I actually lived through this as a quite young and inexperienced person who joined the Bush-Cheney transition team in 2000, and I sort of saw firsthand the way an incoming administration wrestles with shifting from running for office to preparing for office to entering office, and then the way our allies wrestle with it, because it's very hard. And let me just make a couple points from that historical experience. Should also note that Jim and still in office, Kirk Campbell, wrote a really good book about how presidential transitions affect policy. It's one of the few books on this. The first is that the administration itself, the incoming administration, say Romney wins, really doesn't know right now what it would do. I mean, they are so totally preoccupied with running this election that the specifics of their policy once they enter into office are not yet sorted out. They're, I think, reliably kicking the can down the road and saying, look, we're going to sort out all these complex issues when we get there and have to do it. So just sort of cabin all speculation and say we can speculate all we want, but the truth is they themselves on the inside probably don't know how they're going to handle these things. Second is occasionally an incoming administration will not know what it wants to do in a positive sense, but will negate one of the previous administration's policies just to negate it and to separate itself up as different and new. And we certainly saw that in the early parts of 2001 when President Bush succeeded President Clinton. And at least one issue that directly had bearing on Korea, the agreed framework, was negated quite quickly before having sorted out an alternative on what else to do, and without having interagency harmony. So you had early on in March a split between Secretary of State Colin Powell and the White House staff over the agreed framework that just aired out for everyone to see an administration that hadn't sorted itself out internally, just generally not a good thing to do for a new administration, but will happen. Third is in the early months of a new administration, events have a way of intruding on you and forcing your hand. So you may have a good plan of what you want to do, but occasionally something will happen and force you to focus. And in our experience back now 10 years ago, that issue was the P3. There was probably is now a footnote in history, but there was a crisis with China when a American P3 aircraft was forced to land in China, and immediately this brand new administration, before many of the officials have been confirmed, had to deal with it. And actually, in that case, handled it fine. I mean, it could have gone a lot worse, and some of the more aggressive tendencies that would emerge later in the administration were tamped down, and it was handled rather methodically. But that could easily happen again here. Fourth, the allies and our most important partners are often left dangling for quite a while, trying to figure out what the new direction will be of the incoming administration. And it's frustrating for them. And it's not because the value of the alliance has suddenly been downgraded. It's the administration itself is still thrashing around trying to figure out what its policy will be. And so I'm actually, a previous trip of mine to Korea was in May of 2001, where I was with Richard Armitage, then Deputy Secretary of State. It was the first high-level visit by the new administration to Asia in May. You know, this is a long time. This is 4 months, and he visited Japan, Korea, South Korea, and India. And my point here is that in that time, of course, there were dialogues happening. All the ambassadors were coming in, seeing everyone, but there had been no high-level visit, and that was quite a long time to wait. The last thing I'll say is that every new administration that comes off the campaign trail has to go through this process, and it was one of my jobs on the transition, of reconciling what the candidate and his surrogates had said on the campaign trail with what is actually viable and responsible policy once you're in office. And that will happen. I have pity for whoever has to do it because it's often not easy because candidates say some pretty extreme things in the course of a debate and stumping. And when you have to turn that into policy on the first day, it's hard. And I imagine if Romney is lucky enough to win, they will have to do that immediately in the case of Asian policy on this question of him saying he will brand China a currency manipulator on day one. And history is full of examples of new administrations who do foolish things on day one. I think whoever will have to figure out how exactly to handle that. Now, there's the bad news. The good news is my read of American foreign policy towards Asia is that unlike some other regions of the world, like the Middle East, there really is fairly substantial bipartisan consensus about the core elements of the policy. The rise of China is a fact. It needs to be dealt with. It cannot really be stopped, and the main way to deal with it is through engagement, which is both constructive in most areas, a certain amount of hedging against the risks, and then trying to moderate and manage the problematic aspects of Chinese behavior as best you can. There are fringes that quarrel with that, and people who are particularly concerned about one particular functional issue or another who want for a more extreme approach, but substantial consensus. Consensus on the importance of the alliances. There really isn't much debate that the Cold War alliances are still there and are critical. Japan, Korea, Singapore, Australia, of course. But in the last decade, since 9/11, we've really seen a flourishing of our alliances in Southeast Asia as well, in part because of our support for the counterinsurgency problems, especially in the Philippines, also Indonesia for a second. And so the value of the alliances everyone sort of gets. With North Korea, everyone recognizes this is a terribly difficult problem. There really is, everyone gets the joke. I mean, everyone knows more or less exactly what the North Korean game is and has been for a long time. and also knows that there really aren't that many good answers. And so there's consensus around a sort of basic policy of containment with some quarrel about the details of how to deal with particular manifestations of North Korean bad behavior, which happen fairly regularly and reliably. And then finally, that we need to maintain a military presence in Asia. The latest defense policy review announced a pivot from wherever, the Middle East to Asia. I was puzzled by that. I thought we decided on that pivot back in the Clinton administration, and it doesn't seem that new. It's pretty much conventional wisdom that the strategic center of global affairs in the 21st century is really more Asia than the Middle East and Europe, and that is widely accepted in the U.S. Last thing I'll say, and then turn it over, is that when Washington views Asia, it tends to be through the lens of many different functional issues. It's not really so much a geopolitical whole, which is hard for a lot of Americans to conceive because the geography is unfamiliar and the distances are so vast. But there are a whole bunch of different functional issues that, when aggregated, turn into our Asia policy. So these are, at various times, proliferation, currency manipulation, free trade, global warming, human rights. The list goes on and on. All these different functional issues, which are each hugely complex and are difficult for incoming administrations to integrate horizontally across these functional complexities. There's one functional issue which is not on the agenda of this conference, which I will just table, maybe we'll talk about it later, which is cybersecurity. And in particular, the vast exfiltration of data that is half state-sponsored and the other half state-tolerated, especially out of China. And this is going on. It's well known. It's been documented in a number of different authoritative intelligence assessments going back to really late 2007. Many different nations do various forms of this, including my own, the United States. But there is no question that China, one of our great partners in global affairs these days, is both sponsoring extensive corporate and intelligence espionage at the sort of electronic level and tolerates a great deal of it by various surrogate agencies in and around China. How to handle that problem is something which I don't think Washington has yet come to grips with. Thus far, it has been subordinated to many other issues in U.S.-Chinese relations. I think probably sensibly at this moment for a variety of reasons. But one thing I think the new administration will have to kind of address and figure out how to deal with, a process that began late in the Bush administration, is really how to deal with the cybersecurity problem constructively and effectively with China to better protect U.S. national interests in cyberspace. And without going too much further, I'll sort of wrap it in that. Maybe we'll have a little time to discuss later.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jim, and it's a real pleasure to be here on this panel this morning and at this Asan Plenum more generally. I thought I'd make a few remarks this morning about the challenges of trying to really think through the implications of what I will call an Asia-based U.S. strategy. It's talked about, but it's not really fully thought through. The question of the implications and how it follows not only for traditional American allies, emerging American security partners, but as well major powers that previously were really not part of a larger regional order, and finally, and by no means least, relationships with adversaries that persist. Now, at a basic conceptual level, it seems to me there's really not much dispute. When we throw around this verbiage about Asia's centrality, well, why shouldn't Asia be central? Asia constitutes well more than half of the world's population. It's the growing economic center of gravity in global politics. It's kind of an easy catchphrase almost, but we all know that Asia is remarkably diverse, and it seems to me that on that basis alone, requires a much more systematic effort to really think through how you integrate and fit together the different pieces, the pieces that are both geographic and also functional, as Rich Falkenrath just mentioned. So the easy part is what I'll call the bumper sticker. And the Obama administration has clearly, through Secretary of State Clinton and others, tried to articulate the centrality of the Asia, defined as Asia from the Indian Ocean all the way to Japan and beyond, as the centerpiece of American policy, the presumption being that as we make some form of an exit from the wars that have preoccupied the United States over the last decade, that the region as a whole will become much more the central thrust and focal point of our policy. But of course, in doing this, we have our inherited relationships, our traditional allies. I'm thinking about this. I see my old friend Yoichi Funabashi in a back row there, and Yoichi wrote a book almost 20 years ago called Alliance Adrift with respect to the U.S. and Japan. What is remarkable to me is we are now approaching a 20-year point on the deliberations over what to do with the deployment of American forces on Okinawa and a host of related issues. But they are so intractable. They are intractable in terms of Japanese politics, and they are intractable in terms of American, if you will, strategic requirements. So these are not easy issues, and it's easy to kind of use the throwaway language, but it doesn't really get to some of the practical realities that shape this. So this is where we need to examine, I think, much more carefully what American goals and policies are and American expectations, and where various allies and security partners and presumptive major powers, as well as adversaries, fit in this overall process. Let's first of all do the math. I'm not going to give a long disquisition on this, but the Obama administration has basically tried to establish a floor on the deployment of American military forces, arguing that Asia as a whole will not be cut in this process. Now, what that means in what is likely to be a much more stringent future budgetary environment is that if there are going to be cuts, they're going to have to come from elsewhere, if that is indeed the way forward. And I say that only to note that you can't, if you argue that the United States now will concentrate on Asia as a whole, what gets left out in that shuffle? How do you maintain a sense of commitment and presence in other regions, particularly under circumstances where, to be frank, the budget just does not support the kinds of grand goals that are often asserted? So there's a big issue here at the level of American defense policy, which presumes, of course, some expectation that American allies will contribute more fully to this. We see this obviously most specifically recently in the enhanced role of Australia as the United States begins to devote more attention to Southeast Asia. There's been a lot of attention, for example, to the deployments of periodic rotational deployments of American Marines in Darwin. The presumption in some circles is that this is a signal to China. I'm frankly not really convinced of that. I mean, if the idea is that a minimal Marine presence is supposed to somehow reconfigure the overall strategic picture, I don't buy the proposition. It might even be said that the deployments in Darwin actually are, I don't want to say a signal towards Japan, but reflect this effort at a more distributed capability, a less of a singular dependence on the presence of Marines on Okinawa, as the United States tries to proceed, as it has tried in the past, sometimes not with great success, to a more flexible kind of arrangement on the expectation somehow that may be cheaper. Well, that remains to be seen. Of course, if you look at American naval deployments and the like, certainly some of the numbers do suggest a shift more to the Pacific. But even here, given the costs of building new ships and the like, I don't really anticipate some major shift here to the region. Even the new deployments that are being talked about, for example, the littoral combat ship in limited numbers to be sure, the presumption is that this is a more flexible kind of military instrument. It's not really designed for high-end military contingencies. It would be visible, but it's not something nearly as imposing as the larger manifestations of American naval power. But here again, it partly reflects the need of how does the United States sustain a credible, long-term commitment of its military forces, given the staggering costs that are entailed in the building and sustaining of these ships. So I don't want to say that LCS is a magic answer, but it reflects, I think, a realism in DoD in some circles about how you, in fact, assemble and sustain some kind of a meaningful presence. So in all of this, even as the United States continues to aspire and articulate to a role of leadership in the Asia-Pacific region, it seems to me that the dynamics here have changed in significant ways, and that this isn't necessarily all a bad thing. First of all, you have allies who are much more capable. You also have others who are much more capable. And the question is how you find a means, if you can find a means, to reconcile all these developments with an elevated role to various regional powers that in the past may not have assumed as large a role. So I don't think American power in the future, even if it will be very distinctive, will be as singular as it is in the past. That's just simply a statement of a fact, of facts. In this context, therefore, the United States has to ask, how does it make sure that it is present and accounted for? How do we get our regional partners to facilitate, where possible, America's military presence? But what will the presence be designed to do? Clearly, military power is flexible in a variety of ways. The question is how you weight the different components of military power, whether, for example, it should be oriented very heavily still to high-end contingency planning as opposed to a range of other missions that I think often reflect the realities of the region. Now, in all of this, of course, China looms in the background. I don't want to make this the centerpiece of what I say here, but obviously China's the subtext of a lot of this. I don't think that the administration is trying to define Asia policy as China policy, but clearly the recognition of China's growing weight, economic, military, geopolitical, and so forth, underlies a lot of what the United States has sought to do. And although there are criticisms that emanate from various Chinese commentators and the like, I don't know that China, in a larger sense, is necessarily uneasy about a continued American military presence here. It's much more, what is the presence intended for? Where does China fit in this overall process? There are some very interesting criticisms that I've heard from Chinese scholars, not so much of what the United States is doing in the context of enhancing its role, for example, in Southeast Asia, but the criticisms are more directed at the Chinese government itself. The feeling that China perhaps got inattentive to, or at least didn't think as clearly about the role of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. Foolish statements, foolish words, a few overreactions to particular circumstances, and then you find the United States pulled back in to the larger geopolitical competition, particularly, we would note, in Southeast Asia, because I don't think the rebalancing of American forces really affects Northeast Asia all that much. It's much more manifest in Southeast Asia and then on to the Indian Ocean. So the Chinese, in some respects, are beginning to ask themselves questions about the implications of their own actions and deployments and directions, and how do they shape these in a way that do not trigger the possibility of some kind of larger confrontation. In this regard, I don't think that any state in the Asia-Pacific region wants to face a kind of an either-or choice between the United States and China. Certainly, many of China's neighbors want the United States still to be very much present and engaged, and that's fine. But it's an easy or potentially easy path to finding yourself tethered to one or another policy preference of a regional state that, in effect, takes away American influence and American goals and gets linked a little too easily to the preferences of one or another regional actor. So in all of this, I think we need to bear in mind that, to make a very banal observation, Asia's a big place. That one size fits all is not a viable strategy, and that however much we may wish to, the United States may wish to see a reorientation of its power to this pivotal region, it is not as if you blithely walk away from other kinds of regions of major influence. One last point I would make. if the concern over time is about the credibility of American power, that the most important thing the United States can do to reinforce, in my view, to reinforce the credibility of its power in the Asia-Pacific region is to get its own fiscal house in order domestically. If we want to be taken seriously as a power with a sense of goal and direction, the inability, the incapacity of the American political system to arrive at reasonable compromises and reasonable judgments about where it proceeds is absolutely vital. And that's something that I think no matter who the next president may be, they're simply going to have to face. So I think I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Dr. Choi.
Okay. I'd like to thank Asan for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be on the panel with my old friends, and also to speak for myself. Of course, I'm carrying the government official title, but I will speak for myself. And interesting enough, I'm the only non-American panelist in this panel, so I will take the position of devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. Actually, but my points actually have been already covered by Jonathan's points and also the Richard points there. I will skip the general part of a background of what's going on in East Asia. It's like Asia actually captures the essence what's going on in Asia, the innovation, integration, instability, all these things. My general observation of U.S. policy toward East Asia, first actually, while the United States has been arguing the Asia-Pacific country, but the visibility of the United States in Asia-Pacific is not that good enough to compare to other powers. For example, Japan sometimes used to pursue the East Asia community or Asia-Pacific community, and China have become a champion of multilateral dialogue and also has been very successful in forging the background of its own. For example, Shanghai Cooperation Dialogue, and is very visible and influential in various dialogue and fora, while the United States has been focusing on rather bilateral alliance system. That actually the second point. The U.S. position on the East Asia policy has been driven by traditional security concern, rather forgotten the dynamics and natures of change in the East Asia, like the economic integration among the partners and free trade agreement, all these human migration issues. All these issues have been discussed among the regional powers, while the United States wasn't there. So it's rather, and third, actually it's been rather reactive than proactive or leading the situation. So U.S. has been reacting what's going on. So that's why the United States sometimes, from my standpoint, always behind the China in talking about the regional issues and giving us some solutions. U.S. solution always coming back to the same answer, emphasizing alliance. But actually have not taken the nature, the characteristics of the changes. That actually one of the shortcomings of U.S. policy. And actually that's the general observation of U.S. policy toward this region. And actually another point is like while the United actually in 1996, I think that was a Bill Clinton statement, New Asia-Pacific Policy. That was done about, and now we have another. The vision statement could be, the statement could be regarded as a vision statement of the United States toward this region. So almost 20 years have been forgotten, unfortunately. I was expecting, with the inauguration of Obama administration, some kinds of East Asia policy statement, but that's been delayed another 3 years. So it's been driven by the issues rather than the visions or the future plan. So that's why I'm saying the U.S. policy toward East Asia has been reactive rather than proactive. So actually, I'm glad to hear this new vision and U.S. engagement policy or enlargement policy toward East Asia. But the problem is like a continuity and sustainability of that policy. Rhetorically, we have been hearing the same issue over and over and again. But the problem is that this statement should be backed up by more concrete actions. Jonathan's points about military presence is quite important. What should be the roles and missions and capability of U.S. forces in the region in tackling the incoming challenges ahead of us? But instead of taking any serious concern about the basic natures of security environment into the future, just saying that we are going to put our Marines in Darwin for rotating these things. What's the roles and functions of these Marines? Why 250? Why not 2,500? Why we should maintain that level of forces? So actually there should be more fundamental review of the concerns and interests of the United States in East Asia, then coming to the vision statement and followed by the more concrete actions. Of course, I fully understand all these, sometimes 3 elements or 5 elements of U.S. policy toward East Asia, strengthening the alliance relations and developing the partnership and working with China and active participation in multilateral fora, and finally this. But nobody has mentioned about the TPP, economic trade cooperation. It seems to me that the 4 elements, except China, belong to one group. China is another group. But whether it's possible to the United States to develop cooperative working relations with China while strengthening its relations with other Asian powers. The Asian powers, as Jonathan already mentioned, does not want to be situated to make a choice between the United States or China. So we like to see the very cooperative working relation between the China and the United States. The weakest dimension could be the security area, but the security area is the most critical one to judge the basic nature and the direction of U.S.-China relations. We like to see the continued the efforts of the United States to engage China in various dimensions, and also to see more futuristic and clearly backed up by these concrete actions. And of course, I fully share that except this bigger picture or architecture of the East Asia region, the other is a burden sharing issue between the United States and allies. Of course, from South Korean perspective, we are going to have the SMA negotiations, special measures agreement, starting from 2013. So everybody knows that, United States is going to cut down the defense budget. So what are we going to do? The problem, instead of going into the direct discussion about who is going to pay how much, we have to have better understanding of what kinds of roles and missions we should carry out. Then what kinds of division of labor could be shared between the state, between the United States and its ally, must be discussed and also agreed upon that. For that, I'd like to make some recommendations. First, I think the statement made by President Obama would be a good one. But actually, I like to emphasize the process of making that kind of statement is quite critical. Without any kinds of prior consultation or the communication with the allies or partners, that the statement could be considered as a kind of shock to its allies or the countries in the region. But the process itself actually would help us build a confidence and trust in each other. The consultation process is quite critical. The United States has been doing the same. For example, when the process of you published the QDR, actually we were very benefited by having the prior consultation and communication between the allies and the United States. Second, actually, we need to clearly set out, identify the conditions of peace and stability in the region. But we rarely talked about what could be the conditions and peace and stability, what should be the challenges ahead of us. Then, actually, third, the identification process would be required. Of course, it's in multilateral fora. And third, there should be a kind of more concrete roadmap shared among the other allies. And of course, this might be a little bit contradictory one, but actually issue-based engagement would be quite enough, good enough to build confidence in each other. So from that regard, I think this, instead of going bilateral, from bilateral to multilateral, we have to think about some unilateral dialogue and cooperation among the concerned parties in the region. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Terrific contributions by everybody. And I think whether by design or by good fortune, I think there are some common threads that you hear in all of these comments. And I think at the core of them is this issue about the continuity and sustainability of the U.S. role in engagement, and what would that take to have it, and how would it be manifest? And I do think this is it's not an unfamiliar challenge. I mean, for many of us who, much earlier in our careers, spent a lot of time thinking about the transatlantic relationship, this was a perennial issue even in the context of countries that had very, very close relations coming out of World War II and then dealing with the challenge of the Soviet Union. Even there, the issues about continuity, sustainability, commitment, reliability of commitment dogged the transatlantic relationship all through the Cold War period. And here we have an even more complex set of relationships and more of a choice for the countries in the region, because at the end of the day, at least for Western Europe, there was a lot of fear about perhaps the tendency to have to accommodate the Soviet Union if the United States wasn't present. There were such deep antagonisms there that seemed rather far-fetched. But here, the question about if the U.S. isn't present and doesn't have a sustained presence, what does that mean for how others deal with the rise in China? So I think that's one issue that we could explore. The second, I think, which is Jonathan spoke to and Dr. Choi as well, is this question about how do we manifest this? I mean, what gives it credibility? And again, there are some lessons from the European experience. I do think that there's a deep tension between the kind of the operational side of military strategy, which is what military planners do, which says, well, we can do this more cheaply and more effectively based in continental United States. We'll have flexibility, we can do it, and we won't be vulnerable, and all those things that have to do with forward presence, with the long-term political dimension of reassurance that comes with the presence, including in Japan, which is an important issue that, as others have said, is still unresolved. And so the question about if, for fiscal or other reasons, operational reasons, there is a reduced footprint in the region, does that inherently undermine the commitment? Are there other things that can be done? And this, I think, goes to a third very interesting broad point, which is part of the sustainability is the whole being more than the sum of the parts. And I think that that's what Dr. Choi was getting at, is that if you think about this issue by issue, as Rich said, there are obviously reasons to engage, but there's something more there. And I do think, again, speaking as a former administration official, that that's something that the administration has taken seriously, the just being their side of it, the joining the EAS, the creating an ambassador to ASEAN, the participating in the ASEAN summits, the much deeper engagement with individual leaders. If you think about the number of times that President Obama has met with President Lee, with President Hu, with the various Japanese prime ministers, there is a recognition that, as you say, Dr. Choi, that there's more to this than just handling other issues. But is the United States capable of that kind of presence, participation that China clearly does do in these regional organizations, the sort of patience to sit and be part of it? So let me first ask if any of the panelists would like to say a word or two more on this, and then we'll go to the audience. Let me start with Jonathan.
One thought I might make, former Secretary of Defense Gates used to describe the United States as a resident power in the Asia-Pacific region, and I'm not quite sure what he meant, but what I'm asking, and I would appreciate actually comments from Kang Choi, is whether the fact that the United States has to, of necessity, deploy its power to Asia, and not just simply its military power, its political influence, even its economic engagement, does this really change the rules of the road? I mean, maybe at a point where there was less development in Asia, the United States was almost intrinsically welcomed. But now the United States both has to be present, but it has to compete with a lot of others. I'm just sort of wondering, does this create some kind of almost inherent asymmetry, given that the United States, though by interest, by history, has been a major factor across the Asia-Pacific region, especially in East Asia, but does this impose a limit, in some sense, on what the United States can do, or is it something that is simply accepted that, the U.S. may not live in the neighborhood, as it were, but people want the United States in the neighborhood?
Actually, from South Korean perspective, we like to see the continued presence and commitment of U.S. forces in the region. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's why we are talking about this alliance is quite critical in maintaining the baseline of stability and peace in the region. Actually, we were concerned when the United States raised the issue of strategic flexibility. So actually, flow in and flow out. So actually, that means that was a controversial issue. That's why this U.S. wants to have these kinds of strategy while we are talking about more traditional from some Korean perspective, actually, the traditional North Korean threat. So we need more permanent presence, a permanent force structure, but while the United States talking about the rather futuristic one. So with that, we became very concerned about when the new defense strategy guideline was announced. Well, it's a shift of the defense strategy from 2 major theater to 1 major theater war, and then what is the focal point of this one? That's one point. Contradiction one is like, it is going to raise concern of China. So it's military. So actually it's quite to see this kind of paradoxical attitude of Asian powers. Like to see the continued presence of U.S. power, but not over presence of U.S. power. So it's a paradoxical posture, but we have to understand the complexity of Asian countries have with China as well as the United States. But sometimes the United States, actually I don't know whether my description is correct or not, doesn't want to fully understand the complexity of the Asian powers' relations with China and also the United States.
You almost seem to be calling for what we might call the Goldilocks solution. But I don't know whether we should elevate that to a strategic principle or not.
Yeah, but anyway, we like to see the continued maintenance of the 28,500 is the first level. But actually, that was confirmed by that. But the problem, as I said, under that limit, we can think of different force structure and roles and missions, but we rarely discuss about this. What should be the roles and missions, and then capabilities. But we talked about only the numbers. Actually, sometimes number actually carries very symbolic meaning.
Let me turn to Rich, and then we'll go to the audience.
You know, this question about U.S. forces permanently stationed in Asia feels anachronistic in two respects. One is, as you alluded to, Jim, just militarily, it matters less and less. I mean, the physical presence here, given the change in nature of modern warfare, just from a kind of straight military analysis, isn't as important as it was 20, 30 years ago. But the other way that it feels a little anachronistic is, I think in the eyes of many observers who look at U.S.-Asia, the relationship between the U.S. and Asia, and particularly the United States and China, is the military balance is receding in significant relative to the economic balance. And people see the economic shift as really the signal of where the power curve is heading on this one. So both our dependency on China to buy U.S. debt and our dependency on China to buy U.S. exports and to rely on Asian imports to help us pull out of our slow economy seems, I think, in the eyes of many observers and, frankly, a kind of new generation of people coming along engaging this, just intrinsically more important than whether the Marines find a base in Okinawa or not, which they've been trying to do for 20 years. So I wonder if there isn't something of a generational issue here, where we've been working on the Okinawan base or the South Korean status force agreements or shifting control over military command to the Republic of Korean commands from ours for a long time. There is a political military intelligentsia who gets it and has been completely engaged. But isn't it, and my question really is, in the eyes of everyone else, isn't that like less and less important as time goes by?
I think it's a good question. I have to say that it's one of those things that, you know, it has a siren song quality to say, gee, it shouldn't matter. I would be confident, my personal judgment, that if your President Romney comes in and says, you know, we've looked at this thing, it's anachronistic, we're pulling out, right? We promise you we'll be there in the crisis. We're going to be an offshore balancer. We're going to just be like Steve Walt wants us to be. But we'll be there when you need us. Everybody would say, do you remember President Carter? Do you remember? I mean, I think that we underestimate it only because it's not heavily in play.
I got it, but it's easy to negate the extreme. And so certainly not, first of all, he's not my camp, I'm not involved in the camp. But second, the issue is not pull out or not. It's really who cares if we finally sort out the Okinawan status agreement or not, or if in 2012 or 2015 we shift control over forces in the Korean Peninsula. I mean, someone cares. But it's a smaller and smaller niche of highly specialized people, whereas everyone else is looking at it and saying, boy, they got $3 trillion in deployable currency reserves. That matters a whole lot more when we, as Jonathan said, can't even sort out a basic fiscal balance.
I mean, I certainly agree that there's a lot of truth to that. But I do think the question about is there a substitute for military presence to give the credibility is still a deep challenge. And I think we haven't figured out. And I think it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for there to be a deeper diplomatic engagement. I certainly think the economic piece, and I agree, I mean, I mentioned in passing, but I think, one of the things I think was as significant as anything the administration did was TPP. It wasn't an easy decision, frankly, for the administration to come to that, but it was a critical part of trying to diversify the portfolio of engagement and commitment. So let's turn to the audience. I don't know, there are mics being handed around. I don't know, it looks like there are mics. So here we go. Do you have microphones, please? Yeah, there, right.
Walter Lohman with the Heritage Foundation. I will say, Rich, Seoul is probably the worst place in the world to make that case, especially this week, given what the DPRK is up to. Jonathan, I wanted to ask you a question. That's it. I appreciate the nuance with regard to China and the purpose of our forces and all, but isn't it possible to put a finer point on what the pivot is about? It really is about China, right? I mean, if the Marines are not going to Darwin for China, what are they going for? If next week we're going to announce some new arrangements with the Filipinos, what is that about if it's not about China? It seems that the indirection on this actually contributes to Chinese mistrust because they see us doing all these things and it's pretty obvious what it's about, and we tell them, oh, don't worry, it's not about you. Could you comment?
Walter, you raise a very, very relevant point. I mean, you're making an argument that maybe there ought to be a breakout in candor, if you will. I'm not sure I would agree totally with you, although you can certainly argue that just simply because Darwin finds, just simply that it's 2,000 miles from the South China Sea, but it puts you a little more proximate to where there is a desire to sort of be present and accounted for. But I have a hard time going from rotational deployments of Marines in Australia to sort of asking, what is it that we intend to do with these forces? This really gets to Kang Choi's question, that it's not as if Marines are going to storm ashore some misbegotten rock in the middle of the South China Sea. It's more some kind of a visible embodiment in American presence. To be very frank, one of the things that really surprised me is not so much that the decisions were made about Australia, but that it took so long. I worked at RAND for many years. I can remember this being actively discussed, the idea of how do you make more use of Australia as an absolutely number one reliable American ally, with its forces totally cognizant and familiar with American concepts, capabilities, and the like. The fact that Australia more or less speaks the same language as the United States, and certainly simply where it was, not only with respect to Southeast Asia, but also into the Indian Ocean. So it's always been a bit of a puzzle to me that more was not done sooner. But you raise a relevant point. Would it be possible to have an open and honest discussion with China to say that the presence of these forces in some way, directly or indirectly, is a manifestation about anxieties about what the region looks like, if there is some sense of China being overly dominant relative to all the other states in the region? That's a fair point. And, frankly, I think we ought to be able to have an adult conversation with China about this.
I'm Steve Denning from Yonsei University. One of the perks about studying in Asia is you get to look at things from an alternative perspective. And one of my professors at Yonsei, who is very critical of the way in which America perceives the Asia-Pacific, which is very pertinent to this debate, he says that America tends to see things from purely a security perspective, whereas a lot of East Asian countries, if we can speak from a unitary actor perspective, see things through a trade security nexus, meaning they focus more on the economics and how economics affects politics and security. And it made me think of this when Mr. Falkenrath said something about we have a $3 trillion of currency reserves, but the U.S. is obsessed with status of force agreements and then domestic issues such as raising the debt ceiling. I guess what you see now in East Asia that's not acknowledged, especially from the West, and hasn't been really at this plenum yet, is sort of a bifurcated regional order. where you have countries in the Asia-Pacific dependent on China for economic growth because that is the largest market for their exports now, but still dependent on America nominally for security. And I'm just curious as to what the implications are for America's role in the region, where you have countries that look to China to fuel economic growth, but still sort of look to America for a security guarantee. I guess this is more of a long-term question.
It's an excellent question, and I certainly agree with the characterization. So I'm not sure that this isn't, I think some do appreciate this in the United States, but I think it is an important insight. And from my own perspective, I think that that's what worries a lot of American policymakers, is that this isn't sustainable, to have this bifurcation. And that it's part of the reason for trying to think about the economic re-engagement in the region, that this is, the tensions in that model are such that they can't be sustained over time. And that if the United States doesn't play a more central role on the economic front, then trying to just solely focus on the security front won't be able to be sustained, and that the genuine architecture of the region will change. But I'd be interested in, Jonathan?
You've raised a very, very important point, and it seems to be one of the issues on sustainability would very much reflect that if there's a presumption that the United States will continue to be the dominant security provider, where that will leave regional actors secure to cultivate ever larger economic relationships and benefits from ties with China, that just simply isn't going to work. I mean, it's interesting to me that President Obama has been really quite clear in one respect. He's much more focused on China as an economic competitor, or an unfair economic competitor, as he might characterize it, than he is specifically about the presumed dangers of China as an emergent military power. So that's one of the problems with, if you will, the credibility of a kind of, if you will, almost a schizophrenic attitude. I mean, there is the tradition on which we rely, the idea that we have this kind of comfort level, Americans, with the kind of political military role we've played in the region. But this is not your grandfather's East Asia anymore. It's something very, very different.
Thank you. Camille Grand from France. I wanted to bring in some sort of European look into this debate, because it's fascinating to see how the pivot debate has taken place in Europe. The U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, has been explaining that there was not quite a pivot and that was not as important. And you've seen a rise in anxiousness on the part of Europeans on how this was going, and was this a pivot or not. What it seems to me, and I would certainly argue that the pivot makes sense from a grand strategic perspective, but I think what has been the missing part, and I'd be very interested in the panel's view on that, is how does that play in an age of fiscal austerity? Because to pivot when you have all the means you want to reshape your policy is much easier. In a system, and it seems to me that when you look into the details of how, for instance, in the defense field it would be transformed, what you see is that the Pacific Command will be the only command where there won't be reductions. And so that's not a policy of developing and transforming the American military presence in the Asia-Pacific. It's sort of somehow preserving it when in other regions like the Middle East or Europe, it will be downsized. And how does that work? And as a sort of a slight additional question, I'd be interested in your views of where are the Europeans in this? I mean, are they an important? Are they completely irrelevant? Which might be the right answer when it comes to strategic affairs in Asia. Are they important because they take care of other problems, or do they have some sort of small role? Thank you very much.
Right. Well, terrific questions. Let me, if I could, just say a word or two about both of those, and then turn to the panel. I think on the fiscal side, first of all, I think it's important to look at the numbers. I mean, if you're talking about the cost of the presence per se, at least in the medium term, it's actually just as cheap to keep the forces here. It's very expensive to bring them home to the United States. You have to build bases for them. You have to do these things. If you're actually going to downsize the military significantly, there may be some savings. But even there, the numbers are not great. The big numbers for the military budget are operational activities like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and long-term large modernization programs. So in terms of the sustainability of the footprint, I just don't accept the idea that this is a big budget driver, and especially not, I mean, the savings, if there are any, come many years down the road. But it goes to your second point, which is that if you think about the strategy, and I think Dr. Choi mentioned this, some of it is the U.S. presence in East Asia, but some of it is thinking about what the force structure and the doctrine looks like. And so you have this great controversy about air-sea battle and all of that, and so much of that is clearly driven by thinking about what the possible contingencies are in the region. And those things are expensive. I mean, if you start looking at some of the platforms there, that does have. So that's where I think much more than the footprint in the region, the fiscal thing depends more on what kinds of technologies, what kind of platforms, and Jonathan touched on that a little bit. On Europe, I think that it is a underweighted part of the transatlantic relationship is that we talk a lot about cooperating vis-a-vis East Asia, and particularly vis-a-vis China. I mean, I can tell you from my own things, one of the last extended conversations I had with Lady Ashton was, how can we do a better job coordinating U.S. and European policy towards China? Because I do think there's a lot to be done there. I mean, Europeans do have, especially in the economic field, but to some extent in the political field as well, not very much in security, a very significant role that could be played if Europe could figure out how it wants to play it, especially more than as the aggregation of individual national strategies. And I think this goes to a longer conversation about how Europe engages globally on the political and economic front. But I do think that in terms of the sustained dialogue, particularly vis-a-vis China and what kind of role China is going to play, the United States and Europe could do more together, should do more together, and it is an important part about the long-term value of the transatlantic relationship is for those pieces to be as important to the relationship as the more traditional aspects of transatlantic relations.
I'll tell you, my 4 years in federal government bred in me a certain cynicism about the real significance of these statements and slogans that come out in big strategic documents, so like Pivot and other things like that. The truth is our senior policymakers, the ones that really make the decisions, only have so much time in the day. And I think I have this hunch, but if there was some way, there's probably no way to do it in the analytically rigorous way. If you could kind of track the amount of time and work they actually spend on different regions of the world over the last 30 years and somehow control for crises and events, that there would be a very modest shift in the amount that they're actually spending on Europe relative to everything else, assuming they work about the same amount of time, hours in the day. I think the events, all the summitry, become important, become the sort of action-forcing events to force the president and his principal officers to focus on it. But my sense is if you have a new administration coming in, or even this administration, they are allocating their time far more by the crisis and immediate demands of the day than they are some deeply considered larger strategic view of the relative importance of one region vis-a-vis the other. And maybe this is too cynical, but it's just my hunch that these things sound great in seminars in Harvard, the rise of China and the centrality of Asia and the rest, but when you're actually running a government, you don't have the luxury of reserving all that much time for the things which strategically you determine to be the most important when you have a daily menu of crises to deal with.
So you don't think we're always in agreement, I actually disagree with that. I actually think if you did that analysis, you did your little bit of social science, which I always welcome as a dean, you would find it's very different. I think that, there was a great debate. I've been in several administrations, and just the question about where the president spends time, right? So one of the, anecdotal, one of the great kind of budgeting the president's time debate that we had in the Clinton administration was going to OSCE summits, right? Where the president said, what do I need to go there for? But this was in the mid-'90s, right? You had the Balkans going on. You had to go, right? You just had to go. And they weren't very useful, and the president always was unhappy afterwards that we made him go. But it sort of, you went. And flash forward to the Obama administration, the debate came about that in many ways, the most important decision about joining the EAS was the president prepared to go twice a year to East Asia because these things weren't lined up with APEC, right? And so, there was a lot of people said twice a year to Asia. But the decision was to go, and without any, strong view that there was particular deliverables that are going to come out about it. So I do think there is. I mean, it's not, huge, but on the margin, I think you could show a difference in the portfolio. And certainly there was a feeling, and there are many reasons why President Bush didn't do it, but didn't meet with the ASEAN leaders. Secretary Rice didn't go to the RF twice. Those are not trivial factors, I think. Jonathan?
Yeah, two things. I mean, one an immediate one is there's a question of whether or not President Obama will go to Vladivostok for the next APEC summit. It occurs in early September. When I last checked, that's the middle of that 6-month season that Rich referred to. It is the question about how do you demonstrate credibility. I was almost going to suggest flippantly that maybe what the President of the United States needs is an SST to at least cut down on the amount of travel time that is required. But I wanted to make a comment on pivot. Pivot, of course, is not the operative approved term. It's not the politically correct term. President Obama has never used the term pivot. But pivot comes trippingly off the tongue. So, ironically, even as every administration official now has discarded any suggestion of use of word pivot, it has become so entrenched in the chattering class, and it kind of comes easily off the tongue. It sounds more dramatic, if you will, than rebalancing. That sounds much more prosaic. I might also note, of course, is that President Obama is a big basketball player. Anyone who follows basketball knows when you can pivot one way, then you can pivot another way. So I think in an ironic way, it doesn't do a lot to reinforce the sense of the fixity of American commitments to Asia and the Pacific over the longer term. But, it is what it is, and it's used in everything that people read and talk about, so for better or worse.
5 minutes left. Let's try to get it. What I'd like to do is let me take both of these questions right here, and then we'll have the panel respond.
Dong Wang from Peking University. I have two short questions. First, I would like to pick up a common theme touched upon by the panelists. That is, it seems to me there is an incompatibility between the U.S.-led alliance system and any kind of regional security architecture we might envision. So my question is, how are we supposed to reconcile between the bilateralism manifest in the U.S.-led alliance system and the kind of regional security architecture we might envision? And related to that, secondly, it seems to me that China was touched upon throughout the discussion, but it also was pushed a little bit back to the background. So I was wondering, where does, in your view, where does China really fit in this big picture? And shall we think in a more imaginative way to articulate and envision a regional security order that is both non-hierarchical and inclusive? Thank you.
Are you?
Thank you. I think my comments also follow my colleague, Wang Yinwei from Tongji University. Also, there is a contradicted even of your three levels of the bilateral alliance and the multilateral and new partnership. Alliance, in the Chinese view, I think is exclusive. Your new partner and the multilateralism is inclusive. So what kind of role America will play in Eastern Asia? Inclusive role, inclusive power, or exclusive power? And we talk about the sustainable leadership should be based on the sustainable values. I think without shared leadership with shared values, this is also not consistent between your airlines and the new partnership. Then airlines based on the Cold War common values or the update. The new partnership or the new multilateralism is a new kind of shared values. Even your new partnerships, I don't think you have the similar shared values with China and India. So I think it's sustainable leadership should be on a sustainable common or shared values. Thank you.
Well, those are big questions, but I think it's worth just at least trying to touch on them a little bit. And I'd say two things, which is one, again, to look at the European experience. One of the things that happened after the Cold War was we didn't abandon NATO, but we strengthened the more inclusive institutions like the OSCE. And it was a strong conviction of the United States that those two things were not incompatible and that it was possible to develop multiple structures, that the relationships with our allies, whether it's in Western Europe or in East Asia, are no longer alliances against, but they are alliances of values, and that does matter, frankly. I mean, there is an importance, I think, to the United States in the long run to have special ties with countries that do share our values. I disagree with your characterization on India. I think that part of the reasons why there's a growing relationship between the United States and India is precisely because of the values-based nature of that relationship. But I don't think that's preclusive of the inclusive activity. But I think for the United States, and I know there may be some disagreement about that, but it is fundamental to U.S. foreign policy, and it has been fundamental to U.S. foreign policy for most of our history, that the values dimension is important, and that we believe that beyond kind of realist strategic interests, that we have a set of ties that are not only in the interest of our shared value system, but in the long run in the interest of the community as a whole. So we don't see it, I think, as preclusive. I understand that others may not agree with that. The second thing I would say is it's true we haven't focused on China, but ironically, it was not that long ago that everybody said, oh, the United States was just all about a G2 with China, which I think also tells you that the debate has moved on a bit from that as well. Rich, last thoughts?
No, I thought it was an excellent discussion. I will just note again that we've avoided this troublesome issue of cybersecurity, which will come back. And my suggestion is at future conferences like this that you spend a panel of it. I really can't.
I'll promise to organize one next year if Asan will let us do it.
Just for those of you who don't regularly go to Washington, it is a huge topic there. Senate's debating 3 different bills right now, and what to do about this massive theft of U.S. data, both company data and classified data, is a hard question at the highest levels in U.S. government right now.
Just a couple of quick comments from 2 very, very interesting comments from our Chinese colleagues. I suppose you could say that since the United States had, in some significant measure, absented itself from a full role in regional multilateral settings, that for some, this was, certainly in Southeast Asia in particular, this was very much an affirmation of things that those in ASEAN had long sought. But in a way, China, prior to this affirmed commitment from the United States, didn't really have to think about the role of the United States in a lot of these meetings because we weren't as invested in it. We are now. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be some kind of test of wills or what have you. Maybe what the United States is trying to do is to see whether it is possible to somehow reconcile, on the one hand, traditional alliance structures, at least in some selective cases, with a larger commitment to the shape of the region to come. We ought to note, for example, that there are frequent Chinese objections to the alliances as a relic of the Cold War, I guess we can thank North Korea for making sure that this is still very, very much relevant. No one's going to walk away from that. But you could argue in some sense that there is a longer-term transition, not yet fully articulated, that may find the United States thinking about a different set of policies as circumstances change. Secretary of State Clinton spoke at the Naval Academy a few weeks ago. She made this quite explicit without dotting I's and crossing T's, that this is a work in progress for any administration. And there's a very, very long way to go. But I think it ought to begin, frankly, with a much more candid kind of set of discussions so that we don't do arm waving, that we can articulate much more fully where the differences lie if we're going to make any kind of headway, and to avoid, if you will, needless confrontation and worse, that won't find any of the powers more secure, would actually find them over time less secure.
Dr. Choi, you have the last word.
Okay, yeah, actually the economy matters, but it cannot replace the security issues actually in East Asia. So actually, but on the other hand, actually, we like to see the continued, maybe before the efforts of the United States to engage East Asia economically and trade. But the government role is quite limited. That actually function of private sectors, but actually the more profit-generating relation between United States and East Asia. That's one reason. European states actually underrepresentation of Europe in security dimension, but there could be a way to enhance that kind of cooperation in talking about the non-traditional security issues. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks to the panel, to the audience, and to the organizers for an excellent session.
Thank you.
We will now have a short break.